In 1748, the War of Austrian Succession had come to a close. Europe was exhausted, so a series of alliances was formed. Many nations switched diplomatic and political foundations, forming new alliances. This event, known as the Diplomatic Revolution, was supposed to prevent war. And it worked. For a few months. On April 20, 1756, France attacked the island of Minorca, a random British territory not owned by Spain. Now, this wasn't the first French attack, however, as a separate conflict, which will be covered in a coming video, had started 2 years ago in North America. Anyway, Great Britain declared war on France, which led to the enactment of the first of 3 treaties of Versailles of the war. Quick side note, why are there 9 different treaties of Versailles? In this treaty, Austria pledged to support France in case of an attack. This in turn led to the activation of the Anglo-Prussian alliance, which led to war with Russia, then basically all of Europe was involved, okay? You just need to know that. Minorca fell by June, and after a brief stalemate, Prussia took action. Frederick of Prussia wanted to firstly invade Saxony, as to use their resources and eliminate them as a threat to central Brandenburg. The invasion began on August 29, 1756, and, well, let's just say Saxony did not win. With the city of Pirna under siege, Frederick enacted the second part of his plan, invade Bohemia. He marched quickly, but on October 1st, he was defeated by Austrian forces at the Battle of Lobositz. Frederick lost the battle due to disorganization and also outmaneuvering by the Austrians. Ultimately, Frederick's plans had failed, and as he retreated back into Saxony, Europe realized they were in for another long and worldwide war. Following the standard wage of early modern warfare, the campaign slowed down as winter approached. But behind the scenes, both coalitions worked hard to make sure 1757 would be a successful year. Britain firstly built up a small but strategic army from many central German states, such as Hesse and Brunswick. Additionally, they fortified Hanover, which was in a personal union with the British. Frederick began to draw up battle plans. On the other alliance, France and Austria built up capable armies, as Russia prepared for an invasion into East Prussia. Also, Sweden joined the war against the Anglo-Prussian League. Finally, by the time that spring came, both alliances were anticipating many victories. To start, Frederick once again launched an invasion into Bohemia, but this time they started their offensive in Silesia. At first, they were successful. They defeated Austrian forces at the Battle of Prague on May 6, 1757, and then they besieged Austrian forces in Prague on May 6, 1757. Frederick probably felt invincible, so he decided to test his luck at the Battle of Kolin on June 18th. Prussian forces planned to envelop the Austrians before defeating their right flank. None of that really matters, though, because Frederick got his butt kicked, and his first major defeat occurred at this battle. And last but not as important, East Prussia had fallen to Russian forces at the Battle of Gross-Jägersdorf. At this point, it was up to Britain to help Prussia out. How did you let France take Hanover? Yeah, so starting in June, France had invaded Hanover, and after Hanoverian forces were defeated at the Battle of Hastenbach, Hanover surrendered in September. And yeah, this left Western Prussia open to French attack. Additionally, Silesia was left open to Austrian attack. It seemed like the Anglo-Prussian League was on the verge of surrender, until November 5th, 1757. On this day, 41,000 French and Austrian troops met with a mere 22,000 Prussian troops. Despite the outnumbering, Prussia won a decisive victory in the Saxon theater of the war. Prussia had proved their ability to strategize and take on larger, forces once more at the Battle of Leuthen, where Frederick succeeded in taking a larger Austrian force from Silesia. And just to establish a small-sized red fruit on the above Angles, they captured and blockaded Swedish Pomerania. After October 1757, there was only one large blunder in Prussia. From October 10th to 17th, a group of only 5,000 Hungarian Hussars raided and occupied Berlin briefly. Then, in winter, once again, you know the drill, the war slowed down until spring, blah blah blah. Anyway, both sides were reinforced, mainly France and Russia and Britain and Prussia. In March 1758, the first major events occurred in the Hanoverian theater, where Prussian forces had managed to drive out France. This allowed the Anglo-Prussian armies to reopen the Rhineland theater, and in doing so, German forces defeated France in the Battle of Krefeld. But this tiny defeat was nothing compared to what was about to occur on the Eastern Front. Russian forces, who had traveled hundreds of miles through Poland and Lithuania, had made it to Prussia. A force of around 30,000 men met up with 50,000 Russians near the small village of Zorndorf. The Russian soldiers, who had high hopes due to previous victories, thought they could easily win. And so the Battle of Zorndorf ensued. Both sides suffered massive casualties, but right before the Prussian army was ready to admit defeat, King Frederick himself stepped up to command the army. By the end of August 25th, Russia suffered over 16,000 casualties, which forced them to retreat. It was costly, but the Prussians had won their biggest battle yet. Unfortunately for them, Sweden defeated them at the Battle of Tornau a month later, and then for Belen a few days later, but they got to defeat the Russians again on September 18th. On that day, the Prussians won the second of 3 Battle of Kolbergs. These victories against Russia came with a downside, however, because an 80,000-strong Austrian army had marched into Saxony. On October 18th, they met up with 30,000 Prussian troops, who, despite being outnumbered, got absolutely annihilated. Also in October, France made a move, appointing Duc de Choiseul as the new chief minister. This new minister had high hopes, including an invasion of Britain. You can probably tell, but by 1759, everybody wanted the war to end. I won't spoil anything for you, but it's not called the 3 Years' War, so... In April 1759, France made the first moves of the year, causing Ferdinand of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel's worst defeat of the war at Bergen. On the other hand, Russia decided to invade Brandenburg again on July 23rd, where this time, against a smaller Prussian force, they won the Battle of Kay. But this is nothing compared to the Battle of Kunersdorf, which happened only a few months later on August 12, 1759. Russian forces, paired up with Austrian forces for a grand total of almost 60,000 troops, marched to Kunersdorf, Prussia, in order to gain a stronghold near Berlin. When the Russians met up with the 50,000-strong Prussian army under Frederick, he was confident of victory, but after hours of fighting, he had lost over 18,000 troops, more than he had defeated last year at Zorndorf. Embarrassed, Frederick was forced to surrender to the Austro-Russian army, who themselves had lost over 16,000. Frederick lost half of his army and 8 commanders in the battle. This was his biggest blunder of the war. At this point, things couldn't get any worse for Frederick. Oh no, wait, they can. He lost the Battle of Maxen on November 30th, but that wasn't as bad. But unbeknownst to Frederick, France's North American colonies were about to surrender. This would allow tens of thousands of soldiers from that front to assist in the European continent. European tensions were at their peak, and it seemed like either side could win a decisive victory. Anyway, that is going to be all for today's video. This is part 1 of 3 7 Years' War videos that I will be making, so stay tuned for those. And also, this video took a lot of time and effort to make, so please consider subscribing to help me hit 500 subscribers. Thanks for watching. Subscribe.